Hey there! Today we're going to have the first installment of the Inkcyclopedia. There's an introductory video online in which I explain what type of demonstrations I will do, what pens I use, etc. I suggest if you haven't watched that, you watch that first and then come back. Assuming you have watched it, this is the first part. I'm going to cover one ink at a time. I want to give you an overview of a lot of inks, and today we'll focus on one ink which is already on my fingers, one of my favorite inks of all time. That is Noodler's Apache Sunset. Okay, what makes this ink so special? Well, it's a very simple answer: the shading. This is an ink that shades from a dark yellow, I would almost say, which is still legible, to something that is red. And if it's not dark yellow, then at least it's a very light orange. And I think the amount of shading is truly spectacular. I have some other inks that shade well, but I think this one is one of the top shaders in the world. So, a couple of things about this ink. It's made by Noodlers, which means quite simply that if you're not in the US, it can be a bit difficult to come by, but of course there are the US sources. It comes in one of these 3-ounce bottles. They're fairly simple, but I like them a lot. Make sure it's closed. It's got a nice wide opening, so no matter how wide the pen is, you can just stick it in and fill it up. Fantastic ink. I think it flows well. I think it can feather a bit on some types of paper, but I did the sample on Rhodia paper, which is the paper I always use, and I'm looking at it right now, but I really don't see any shading there. Sorry, I do see shading there. I don't see any feathering there. So I think that should be okay. It's relatively inexpensive. You get quite a large amount of ink for that amount of money. So get it. That's all I can say. If you don't own this, get it. I would be surprised if you are disappointed by this ink. So there you have it. Enough talk. I think we should move on to writing. Okay, so here we have some Noodlers. Apache Sunset. I start with the fine nib, so I put an F in the margin. Just manage. So if you cannot really see what I'm doing, feel free to download the high resolution still of the writing so that you can see what I did in a bit more detail. Here we have the medium. Shading is a bit more apparent here. I'm writing a bit smaller so that I can hopefully fit the sample in one line. So hopefully you should be able to see that there is a bit more shading going on in that specific nib. Then we go to a broad. Shading is very apparent here. So there we go. So far there is absolutely no feathering. And then we have the italic nib. Okay, so you should be able to see, I think. Let me just try and zoom in a bit. Or quite a bit, actually. No refocusing. There we go. Shouldn't overdo the zooming. There is no feathering. That's actually all I wanted to show you. Okay. Right. Now, flow has actually been fairly consistent. You may have seen that there was no skipping or anything. Let's try to push this to the limits a bit and do some flexing. I will pose this pen. For some reason I like the word hello when testing line variation. It's probably because of all the loops. When it comes to loops, I can think of another word that comes to mind. Now, interestingly enough, I think you can see the shading here very well. Again, take a look at the high-res picture if you can't see what I'm pointing at here, but here you see that the ink is of a very dark orange, which I would almost say leans towards red, whereas this thinner line is actually fairly orange and not red at all. So the amount of shading here is pretty impressive. Now what I can do is I can color a bit of, I always call that coloring, just put down a patch of ink. I use the italic nib for that. There is still no feathering here, and with this coloring you also see the shade from a very light orange to something that's a much darker orange. No true red here. The red you would see when flexing to the max. Okay. So what about drying time? Well, it's a pretty wet ink, but of course I just wrote this, and this was with flex, so with a lot of ink. What about these things? Well, that's dry, medium is dry, broad is dry, and italic is dry. In my experience, Apache Sunset is a wet ink. So I'll just do another bit of writing. Now, if I start to wipe stuff here, you'll see it's still wet. So, after a few seconds, it's actually still wet, so you can see it is a fairly wet ink. Now, I love that, but for some purposes that may not be extremely suited, it's still wet. So, I can imagine that there are specific professions or you know, purposes of where you write, but where wet ink is actually not very useful. Well, then maybe Apache Sunset is not the right choice for you. See, now starting to get dry. Okay, and still this was a bit wet, but that was the last bit I wrote. This is dry now. So we'll take multiple seconds to dry. I was just talking there to fill up a little bit of time, you see. Okay, so what about waterproofness? Well, this is dry now, as you can see. Let's just add a bit of water. I'll just leave that for a bit, and then we'll go on. What about giving you a somewhat better overview of the color? Well, for that we'll have the plakat. See that? Now that's a serious nib. Or, in the words of a wise person, serious nibbage. Now, such a nib is actually only used in calligraphy, because for everyday writing it would be pointless. I have to prepare a little bit on a sheet of paper off camera. Okay, let's see what I can do. This should give you an idea of the color. Let's see if we can do a double pass. Double pass from that point. And then a triple pass. Now of course this is extremely wet. Triple pass from that point. So that should give you a bit of an idea of the color. What you can see is the very nice shading, I think. Once again, what you can see is on top here a bright yellow, which goes down via orange to what is pretty much red. Now, I have to tell you, I absolutely love that. I really think it's a beautifully shaded color. Okay, let's have a look at that little, those blobs of water. I just pushed some water into the ink there. This blue, that's not from the ink, that was on my cloth. But what you can see, and again, have a look at the high-res picture, is that these letters are almost gone. They've dissolved. So, if you're looking for waterproofness, this is not the ink for you. Okay. I'm just going to write a bit more to give you a better idea of the ink. One thing that may be useful to discuss is ease of cleaning. Well, actually, I found Apache Sunset to be very easy to clean from a pen. Some reds, I have found, can be a little bit difficult to get out of your pen. But Apache Sunset I've always been able to flush out really easily. I just realized I put down F there, and this is clearly flex writing, but some simple fine writing under no pressure would be something like that. Like that. Okay, there we go. So cleaning it is easy, which is a concern to some people. Well, it's not really an issue. Let's do a bit of different writing just to give you an idea. A little bit of broad. I love the broad nib on this paper. I love the broad nib on this Lamy Safari. Fairly inexpensive pen. Seems to be missing something there, but you probably know what I'm talking about by now. The Lamy Safari has a broad nib that is very broad, but very smooth. Broad? Oh, broad, that was an O. Broad. Okay. And then this Italics pen, that's the brand name, with the italic nib. This little cross you can ignore, it was merely an indication of what would be on cam. Of course, with this we can do something else. It is an italic nib after all. That was a sort of Gothic capital, and now for some reason I've immediately moved on to foundational calligraphy. I don't know why. Come on, let's go back to Gothic. This is going to be tricky. Okay. Oh, this is not Gothic again. What's going on? My writing is taking over for me. That's Gothic. Should have started another way, but this is not a calligraphy lesson. Apache sunset. Italic. Right, so there you have it. We've covered some regular writing, we've covered flex, we've covered waterproofness and drying time, we've covered the coloration, which I will make sure this dries, and then I take the high resolution still so that you can actually have a look at it. Remember that this was from this point on you get the second pass, and from this point on you get the third pass. Of course the ink was dry, but the problem with a nib like this is if you have to wait until it's all dried up, you're, well, about 15 minutes ahead of time, so I'll make sure it dries naturally, no blotting, whatever, and then I'll take a picture. Here we have some further writing in the different nibs, just to give you an idea. Apache Sunset is a fantastic ink. I really love it. I can completely see that there are specific situations where this color would be too bright or too flashy to use. But if you have a chance to purchase it, I really recommend it, because the shading is just out of this world. And that makes it a really nice ink to use. It's wet, which is something I like. Sorry, I have to move some stuff there. There we go. Okay, so I hope this was useful. I hope I have convinced you to give this ink a try. Any issues, questions, comments, just put them down below. And until then, I thank you for watching, and bye-bye!